This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, March the 17th, 2024. There was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago on Gen Z at work. Lots of pieces, new books and thinking, arguments about whether Gen Z is different and whether the workplace should or shouldn't be transformed by Gen Z and the new sensibilities of younger people when it comes to the workplace. This piece was about what happens when you have a Gen Z boss. Interesting idea. I have Gen Z kids, not a boss. I'm not sure I'd want my kids to be my boss. One person who's done a lot of thinking about Gen Z and other gens is my guest today, Elaine Lin Hering. She teaches or has taught at Harvard Law School, and she's an expert in workplace culture. She's a facilitator, a speaker, and a writer. And most recently, she has written a book called Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. The book is out on Tuesday, and Elaine Lin Hering is joining us from her home in Berkeley, California, just over the bay. Elaine, I've introduced this in generational terms. Is your book a generational book? Do you tend to be shall we say, a generational facilitators, or are the issues you're addressing in the book about unlearning silence in the workplace, is this as relevant for people in their 50s and 60s as it is for people in their 20s and 30s?
I see silence as a human issue rather than a generational issue. Of course, knowing that generation is only one of many identities we each hold. Now, generation comes into play in that the silent generation, right, those who lived through World War II, have certain norms, assumptions, values, like children should be seen and not heard. There's a lot of history as to how that all came to be. And as your first article clips showed, Gen Z might see silence and voice in a different way. But whether or not we talk about things, whether or not we believe we have a voice, whether or not we cultivate a work environment in which people can say what they really think, bring their full selves to work, and happy to explain why I put that in quotes, all of that is a human issue.
It's interesting, Elaine, that you bring up the idea or the ideal of the silent generation. At least it was an ideal, the Second World War generation. They went to war, they fought heroically, or this is at least, maybe it's a myth, but this is how they've been presented by historians. They went to war, they fought, they came back, they worked hard, they built America up as a superpower, and they remained silent. So silence historically has always been seen as a strength. Why? What's changed culturally so that now we have books like yours about unlearning silence? Why is silence, like everything else, why has it become such a political issue?
Well, let's actually define silence first, because I would argue that there is good silence, that pause between stimulus and response, the meditative silence, the quiet silence that maybe all of us as human beings need more of. The silence I'm talking about in my book is when there's not enough room for your thoughts, your preferences. It's when you weren't invited to the meeting or you didn't think you could ask. It's when you think that in order to stay at the table, in order to keep your job, you have to keep your mouth shut. That silence to me says, not all of us have the privilege of getting to be who we actually are. And of course, today, silence is politicized in what are we saying about social issues? What are we not saying about social issues? But as you all may very well know, traditional publishing takes about 2 years. So I was writing this book really looking at the workplace of I've taught negotiation, difficult conversations, feedback skills on 6 continents, across industries, across levels of seniority. And while the tools and frameworks from my colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Program, I believe, are sound, I noticed a pattern that some people still don't negotiate. Some people still don't have those difficult conversations. Some people still don't give or receive feedback, no matter how much HR tells them they should. And ask the question, why is that? Now, the advice that is offered is, well, speak up, have more courage, have more confidence. And that seemed wholly unsatisfying and at times irresponsible to me. And the answer I landed on was, we all have learned to stay silent, whether we're part of the silent generation or otherwise, from who kicked us under the kitchen table if we said something that they thought was out of line at dinner, to the look that someone shoots you in a meeting, to whether you get re-invited to the meeting or not. That if we really want to have constructive dialogue, if we want to have the best ideas come forth, not just the loudest ones, we need to unlearn the ways that we silence ourselves, the ways that we silence the people we lead, and how silence is baked into the systems, the policies and practices that affect all of us.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Elaine, everyone would agree with you. I think there are some people who believe that people talk up too much.
Mhm.
We'll talk about that later. You bring up the P word, privilege. It's often a word that's hurled like a grenade into conversations like this, as if privilege is a bad thing, and it's never entirely clear what it means. You've taught at Harvard Law.
Mhm.
In fact, I think you've presented some of the theses in the book, Unlearning Silence, at Harvard Law School. To what extent is the language you're using, this argument, is it become part of the new language of the elite, of
Hmm.
legal elite, of an HR elite, of a corporate elite? And it's become a kind of happy talk. Everyone talks it because it's basically become the conventional way of not just doing business, but a conventional way of presenting oneself.
Hmm. I hope that we get to a day when everyone is talking about silence, because whether or not we each agree with one another, because at least it allows us to name what I believe and have diagnosed as the problem. Traditionally, people are told, speak up, have more confidence, have more courage. If you're not getting heard, the problem is you. If you're not influencing people, it's because of you, versus asking the question, what role does silence play on our team? And maybe the answer is not that much of a role. Maybe the answer is it disproportionately impacts certain people more than others. So I'd argue that being able to discuss the role of silence to examine what role it plays with us would be a productive conversation.
What about the point I made earlier, Elaine? You granted, I'm not sure whether it was
Mm,
sympathetically or otherwise, when I made the point that some people believe that people express themselves too much with social media,
yeah.
with all these self-expression forums in and out of the workplace, that people should just shut up and do their work and go home. And if they want to
Mhm,
talk, then they can.
mhm. That was a sympathetic grunt because I think we all know some of those people. And many of us worry about being that overbearing person who takes up too much space in a conversation, which means that other people feel like they can't be seen or heard. And so that is certainly part of the equation. The question is, who is actually getting heard? And oftentimes, my work across industries, across cultures, has made me notice that even those people who take up a lot of airtime don't necessarily get heard, because there is the Babel hypothesis of leadership that says the people who talk the most are coded and their behaviors interpreted as high potential leaders. Um, but oftentimes people tune them out, right? There Andrew goes again, just shooting off his mouth. I'll just wait, grin, and bear it until he's done talking, and then I'll re engage the conversation. So just because someone is spending a lot of time talking and taking up airtime doesn't actually mean they're getting heard. And there's the impact that we have on each other of, is there room in this conversation for each of our perspectives, each of our insights? Or are we missing out on key insights that lead us to groupthink, that mean that we end up having most corporate scandals of the last 200 years coming from someone spoke up and was not heard, or or no one spoke up? And then we end up with situations like Boeing is dealing with now.
Elaine, we live in a country, for better or worse, of enormous political, cultural,
Mhm.
and economic divisions where people really struggle to talk to one another or at least be heard.
Yeah.
We've done many shows on that.
Mm.
Why should the corporation be different? Why should anyone be willing to listen to other people when they often strongly disagree, whether it's maybe political, but politics is always there, inside or outside the corporation. There's always a political tinge. I mean, as you know better than I do, there's a huge controversy now within Silicon Valley and big tech firms about whether workers at companies, often junior workers at companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook, speak up too much, and whether their leaders listen to them. To what extent do the issues that you're writing about reflect a broader crisis, perhaps in America?
Mm. I wish that the issues I have written about were not part of a greater crisis in America. And yet, because Americans are also human, we are, I'd argue, afflicted or impacted by these same issues. In the workplace, it is a question of, for leaders, I'd be asking leaders, what might we be missing if we cannot listen across differences? What might be we be missing if the people on our teams can't tell us what they really think or what they see, or when the data suggests that we're going to have a supply chain issue or there's a product that's not going to work? As leaders, if we cannot hear that, if we are silencing people on our teams, even unintentionally, we end up living in a skewed sense of reality that does not allow us to make sound decisions. And then there's a broader social issue, and it's been interesting with the work across cultures to realize it's not just an American issue. Fundamentally, a question of, can we coexist? Can we hear one another to be able to see each other's humanity? And is there enough room for each of our humanity? Being seen, known, and heard is a buffer both against the physical ailments that come with having to edit, self-censor, or silence yourself, but is also a hedge against this epidemic of loneliness that our Surgeon General has talked about, that there's such social isolation because of our inability to A, hear one another across differences, and B, even share. Right? What do I think, for fear of being ostracized or cut out? That silence so often seems the only option, which isn't actually benefiting us as we go further into our own trenches.
Yeah, I wonder, and it's a really interesting question. I don't know what the answer is, and I'm sure that everyone will give their own answer, whether there's a connection between what you call this epidemic of loneliness and either too much silence or
Mm.
too much noise. Maybe we're just talking to ourselves. You brought up the the T word earlier, Elaine, team,
Mm.
which seems to me to be a euphemism for hierarchy, because of course all corporate teams are made up of senior and junior people.
Yeah.
What does your book suggest in terms of unlearning silence about either speaking or not speaking in the presence of superiors within corporate hierarchy? Should one speak more or less
Mm.
if the boss is in the room?
Mhm. This is where my book differs than most every other book on the market, at least the ones I've come across. Traditionally, the advice is, if you want to get heard, you need to speak up. You need to be strategic about who you're speaking to, and certainly make yourself known to the higher ups, the people with the real power. And while I'd agree with that advice and to do it strategically, meaning you might actually be silent in the short term to move your stakeholders sufficiently to a place where they can hear you. But the difference to me is actually my call to action for well-intentioned leaders, that each of us as well-intentioned leaders actually needs to examine the ways we might be silencing our teams. This goes back to our earlier conversation of, as a leader, as a CEO, as someone in the C-suite, what might I be missing if I have either created or perpetuated a culture of silence on my team? I cannot make sound decisions for the future of the company, for the business, for our bottom line, if I do not have accurate data. And I, as an executive, am not going to be closest to the data. That can no longer be my role. But social psychologists have long identified this phenomenon called organizational silence, which is the collective phenomenon of saying nothing. The more that people higher up on the hierarchy are perceived as not pushing back, not having, not seeing and sharing differences of opinion, the more the narrative becomes, oh, we don't talk about things like that here. Or if you push back, you're going to get cut out and lose your job. So the role for a leader is to really examine, A, what culture am I building on my team? Am I building a culture of voice or a culture of silence? And also B, what can I do to make sure I'm getting, very selfishly, good data?
Well, certainly my show is all about unlearning silence. I hope we don't shut anyone up. And I want to thank Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, a very sophisticated and yet, I wouldn't say noisy, but certainly outspoken journal. Excellent new publication. Going to run a short piece on Liberties. And then we'll be back with Elaine Lin Hering to talk about how to unlearn silence. So don't go away, anyone. Don't talk.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with the Berkeley-based speaking coach, advisor, corporate buzzfly, Elaine Lin Hering, who has a new book out, Unlearning Silence, How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. I'm not sure that all senior people in corporations, Elaine, will be thrilled with the book. We'll come to that. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I often think books are, even business books, have a strong element of autobiography. You're clearly not someone who's silent. Did you have to unlearn silence?
Absolutely. Everyone says that you write the book that you needed when you were younger. I have been saying I wrote the book that I still need. So I appreciate the observation, or at least hypothesis you've put, that I'm clearly not silent. And I would say for most of my life, I have been. I was an immigrant from Taiwan. I grew up in the States. I'm the youngest daughter in that family, and I grew up in the Christian church that very much told me, turn the other cheek, right? Be the bigger person. Don't argue, don't push back. And as someone junior in a lot of fields, I was rewarded for that. I was a good team player. I was easy to work with. And for a long time, I thought my only value came from being able to propagate and amplify someone else's ideas versus having ideas of my own. I also vowed to never write a book unless I had something to add to the conversation, because in the negotiation world, I was watching lots of publications come out that essentially regurgitated a lot of the classic negotiation interest-based advice. But when I made this observation we discussed earlier about this training and investment around negotiation, difficult conversations, and feedback skills not actually working all the time, I thought there's something here for us to talk about. So I wouldn't argue that my book is the be-all, end-all book on silence. I hope it pushes the conversation forward and has us each examine, what role does silence play in my life? In what ways does it undercut how I want to be showing up and the impact I'm having? And of course, what's the impact on the people around me, the team I lead, the business I'm building, the world I'm in?
How'd your family react when silent Elaine, silent, dutiful Elaine became a bit of a pain in the neck?
That is an ongoing conversation. It is an ongoing conversation that is a conversation because it has taken understanding on both sides, right? Fundamentally, what are you writing about? Why does this matter? Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if we agree, disagree. And it sparked really productive conversations that I'm grateful for. And there's part of me that says, if my family can unlearn silence, have these conversations, it also gives me hope that we can do it more broadly.
Families, of course, are at least seen traditionally as hierarchies. Parents supposedly has more authority than children.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting then that really, as in institutional terms, there isn't a great deal of difference between unlearning silence in a family and unlearning silence in a corporation?
I'd argue that oftentimes unlearning silence at home in a family, whether that is your family by birth or by choice, is even harder, right? At work, you can at least try to draw the boundary to say it's just work. I'll separate that. But in terms of being known in your own family, do people actually know who I am? Am I accepted? Isn't acceptance, which doesn't mean you don't ever change. Acceptance is at the core of love. So if at home in our families we feel silenced, unseen, unheard, that is a really terrible place to stay. But to me, it's also not the place we have to stay. It is the place that we can work from to get to a different place. Because at least in family, I would hope that there is more good intention to actually understand one another, appreciate one another, and grow together going forward.
We live, for better or worse, Elaine, I think, in a noisy culture. Certainly, social media is very noisy. Are you concerned with that? Does the noise, the opinion, the anger, uh, perhaps often the anonymity,
Mm,
the unaccountability of social media, is
mhm.
that a problem in terms of your arguments about unlearning silence?
Well, so unlearning silence doesn't mean saying everything to everyone all the time. Unlearning silence is the awareness of the role silence plays in your life and the agency to use your voice as you see fit. Even if there's a lot of noise in social media, that anonymity means I'm not taking accountability or ownership over my voice, which doesn't allow us to get to a productive place of engagement or dialogue. We'd also want to examine in social media circles or in the workplaces, which voices are we hearing, which are accepted, which are normed, and which are missing, which again leads us back to this point of missing data, missing perspectives.
Elaine, these types of books, I mean to sound patronizing, often come with corporate examples,
Mm,
companies that are doing it right. Often when it comes to this sort of thing, people bring up Unilever. I'm not sure whether
mm,
they're good at unlearning silence, but do you have corporate examples? We all know companies, most companies or many companies do this wrong.
mhm,
But are there models, corporate models for helping both senior and junior people unlearn silence, which you
mm.
use in your book?
I do not name any specific companies. I use a series of case studies, all anonymized, from my client work, conversations I've had. And the intentionality there is every organization is dynamic. Even if we take a snapshot of Unilever now, or we take a snapshot of Boeing at a point in time, fill in the blank company, companies evolve, particularly as economic pressures change, as leaders turn over, all those different factors. What we're really looking for though is how do you as a leader build a team that that is ideally aligned with your own values and also brings forth those best ideas, not just the loudest ones. So if you are looking for collaboration and innovation and engagement, employee engagement, retention, what are the micro moves that you can do in your own leadership that create that culture of voice? And then chapter 10, we get to the systemic, big picture, corporate aspect of it. Now, in my consulting work, I work with organizations looking at all those levers together, but really looking at for an individual, what can you do? Knowing that progress at the whole, at the organization level, is much more involved and requires that prerequisite of individuals exercising their agency and making those choices toward a culture of voice to start with.
Elaine, you've mentioned Boeing a couple of times. Boeing has had some very press recently, doors and other sorts of objects falling off Boeing planes, and they seem to be in perpetual crisis.
Mm.
I'm not sure if you've done any work with Boeing, but are they an example perhaps of a corporation where people should have spoken up?
The thing is, with Boeing, people did speak up. Uh, I believe it was Mr. Jarrett who, as of a couple days ago, was found dead in his vehicle, and it is being investigated as a
Mm.
likely suicide. And the reporting on his death so far is to say back in 2019, so now we're talking 5 years ago, he mentioned something to his manager and he was moved to a different plant. He noticed other things that did not make sense to him that he thought were safety issues. Again, he reported them, and then he was transferred to a different department. Then he left the organization, citing safety concerns and no longer himself flying because he was concerned about the safety of the vehicle and the turn that the organization had taken. And then he became known as the official whistleblower. And his family and others, his lawyer, noted the strain and the stress on his body over time of the pressures of being challenged, of not being believed, of being sidelined, and of course, this ending, at least to his life, that seems like it could have been prevented many different points along the way. So the challenge is not that people aren't speaking up, but that when they do speak up, they are not believed, and the consequences and the costs are extremely high.
You use this term whistleblowing, which he was, tragic story. To what extent are you suggesting an unlearning silence that we're all one way or the other whistleblowers, even in a very small scale sense?
I would hope that we don't even need to get to the point of whistleblowing, because we are cultivating environments in our families and in our workplaces, in our communities, where we can be in regular dialogue. For me to say, I see things differently, and you hearing that would say, huh, that's interesting. Let me think about that. And then we would continue the conversation to say, what are we going to do about that? If you don't also see it as an issue, tell me why. But we can actually have that conversation rather than remaining in our silos and telling stories about each other and not solving the problems that are going to come bite us later on. So in my ideal world, since that was the question asked, we wouldn't even get to the point of having to blow the whistle, because we would be in conversation and that conversation would be acceptable and normed.
Finally, Elaine, is there a certain sort of beauty about silence? I'm thinking of monastic retreats of one kind or another. There's a great deal of fashion for those, both religiously or otherwise, of going away, of remaining silent. I know that when you talk about unlearning silence, you're talking about it in a corporate world. But what do you make in the context of your arguments and research about, if you like, a new cult of silence, of retreating into oneself and of not opening one's mouth? Is that a piece of what you're describing, or is it a separate issue?
I'd argue that it's separate. To me, that goes in the category of that generative silence, of that intentional silence. The challenge about a retreat is that you often need to end up coming back into the real world. So what are you going to do there? Chapter 3 of the book is also a chapter that talks about when silence makes sense. So I'm going to be very clear that unlearning silence, as I've said before, is not about saying everything all the time to everyone. The world is far too noisy and complex for that. But the difference between silence that is additive or that silence is harmful is agency. Do I get to choose when I want to use my voice? Could I be accepted and heard? Or do I feel like I have to bite my tongue and silence is the only option for keeping my job or staying in this relationship?